Look, it's a great pleasure, and I'm very pleased to have been invited to come here and speak and talk to your annual general meeting. It's always a pleasure, as I was saying before, but you may not have heard, to come back to Tasmania. My husband's spent a fair chunk of his childhood here, and so there's a personal reason for that. And a few years ago, when I was editing Griffith Review, we did a special edition of on Tasmania, which some of you may recall, which is called Tasmania The Tipping Point, which was, I think, well, I know it was the best-selling ever edition of Griffith Review. I think we sold 20,000 copies of that edition, which is amazing. Partly helped in this following year that the University of Tasmania did something quite remarkable, and they gave to every new student a copy of that edition of Griffith Review, which was a very interesting exercise, very generous gift, and resulted in some amazing feedback. I got letters from people who had spent much of their lives here, who said, I never really quite understood where I came from until I started to read that edition. It gave me a whole lot of layers of understanding. So that was, I think, something which I'm very proud to have done in conjunction with Natasha Chicha, who was here running the English Clark Centre at the time. So as I was starting to say, I was acknowledging the elders and traditional owners of these lands, and just making the point that that sort of, the acknowledgement of prior occupation and long-standing civilisation and settlement in Australia is something that has only relatively recently started to be done as a matter of course. And I think we need to keep that in our heads, because it's remarkable the amount of loss that occurred, and especially in this island, because it's all over the country. But the stories here are so well known, thanks in large part both to the persistence of an enduring storytelling and holding on to the past from First Nations people, but also supported actively by historians who are able to draw on the very extensive records of that period and continuing periods to actually tell those stories, which are becoming better known now as a result. As well as acknowledging the traditional owners and that Indigenous knowledge, which is now starting to become so much more a part of our lives, I'd like to acknowledge the elders of this organisation. And I don't say that because of the grey hairs, but because of the wisdom and effort that has gone into fostering the Friends of the ABC over so many years now. I've noticed Margaret here, and I'd like to acknowledge the work that she's done. It's really important that this notion of respect of elders isn't something which is just confined to Indigenous communities. That it's actually something that we should all be taking a pride in and making an effort for. Now, I look around, you probably have these battles with your children and grandchildren. But there is real knowledge that needs to be shared and communicated. One of the things that really struck me when I was writing the book, The Idea of Australia, was just a line that I came across. So I was trying to work out why change happened and why it stalled. What was the reason that we could move ahead with great leaps and bounds and then pull back and be so scared and fearful of change? And there was a great line by an Anglo-American historian, Linda Colley, who said that change generally took 70 years and 10, i.e. a lifetime, before it sort of became embedded. And that I thought was a really interesting observation, because some change seems to happen in a flash, others seems to take forever, like I was talking about before about the acknowledgement of traditional owners. But others, you don't see it happening, but it's building, and then all of a sudden it happens and you think, where did that come from? Oh, it's been a process that people have been grappling with over a long period. So I found that 70 years and 10 line quite helpful, and I traced in the book quite a number of changes that have occurred and others that haven't, and put them against that timeline. So some were 70 years and 12, and some were 70 years, and some were 40 years, some still hadn't happened. So I think that we've got to accept that change takes its own good time. But one of the lines that I came across, which I found very useful and have used since in talking about it, was an observation by D.H. Lawrence, that the ideas of one generation become the instincts of the next. And I think that's a really helpful sort of thought, because the ideas that those of us who've grown up with, for instance, the ABC public broadcasting, who saw how the country changed and evolved as a result of the information, the discussion, the expertise, the privileging of Australian stories in drama and other cultural activities, the creating the opportunities for Australian music for of all sorts. Those of us who saw that as it unfolded, that became part of our ideas of how this country works. And what I think you're saying in commenting on the number of younger people who are now joining Friends of ABC is that it becomes part of an instinct then for the next generation. The things that we've sort of both been pleasantly surprised by and advocated for and so on, if we're talking about it, we're communicating in our immediate circles with our children and friends and others, that the chances are that it gets picked up by them and just becomes an instinct. Well, why wouldn't you have something like this? It's so obviously good. But what I think we sometimes forget is you actually have to make those arguments. You can't just assume that what made sense, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, or even 90s is going to be what makes sense now. And so keeping on your toes and changing the arguments and evolving it and going back and asking, as I will over the course of this talk, what was it that made something like the ABC? What was the problem that the ABC was answering when it was created in the 1930s, or the BBC 10 years earlier? What was the problem that needed to be solved that this was the answer to? So what is the problem we're now facing that needs maybe the same answer, maybe it's a different answer, but we need to actually go back to first principles in trying to do that. And out of those ideas will come the instincts that will hold the next generation. The theme of my talk today is about the place of public broadcasting in the digital age. And I want to just tell you a few of my other experiences in addition to the bio that was described earlier, because I've had quite a long experience in terms of navigating this space of sort of digital transformation. In the late 1980s, Jeff Herriot, I don't see who's here today, but he's obviously a very locally important former ABC employee who's been one of the most stalwart defenders of ABC as a soft power in terms of international broadcasting, was working in ABC Corporate, and at the time I just published Reviving the Fourth Estate and moved back to Sydney, and Jeff and Brian Johns asked me to do a report on what digital might mean for the public broadcaster. And I didn't know a lot about it, obviously, but nor did anyone much else, so that was an advantage. Anyway, I did a quite long report for them and then subsequently joined ABC Corporate in a corporate role. The day I joined, Brian Johns, who was the managing director at the time, called me into his office because Michael Kroger, who had not long been a member of the ABC board, had gone on, I don't know, AM, World Today, one of the current affairs programs, and said the ABC should sell ABC Digital. That clearly this was a money-making opportunity, that the ABC was not taken seriously, and it was time to sell it because there was, ABC Digital was well ahead of all the major newspapers in terms of creating an online space. And Brian called me into his office and said, I need a paper for the next board meeting in, like a month or a few weeks, it was very short, about this idea, whether it's got any legs, whether it's not got legs, and how it might impact us. So I set about updating the paper that I'd previously done and then doing a whole lot more research, and we called the paper the Digital Dividend. And it wasn't a digital dividend in the way that Michael Kroger wanted it, that is, money could be gained by selling it, but rather there was a digital dividend which paid back to the Australian people and to the organisation. That the process of making all the content digital was going to mean that we had a way of reaching more people, of finding new ways of communicating, of finding new networks, finding new audiences, of putting bits and pieces from the past, like the archives, for instance, into a digital format so that it could be available. I think it's probably fair to say that probably marked the beginning of my less than stellar career association with Michael Kroger, because he kept on coming back to that idea, and the board actually bought the line that we put, that actually there was a benefit to the whole organisation of having digital not as something which could be stripped out, because actually you couldn't strip it out. You couldn't strip out what was being made available by digital without actually going back into the core. I mean, they grew out of each other, and so it was an interesting argument, and it's one which, I mean, now we don't hear that, but for quite a long time there were arguments about selling ABC Digital because there was money to be made from it. I think that the whole process then of the digitisation process was one that was very fraught. So my role was, at that time, it's 1998, was to have, was digital, some sort of weird title, digital coordination or digital, I don't know, it was something. The ABC at the time had 5,500 employees, and most of them were bitterly opposed to anything to do with digital. They saw this as the beginning of the end. At the time, what did we have? We had one television station, there was Radio National, local radio, Classic FM and Triple J. I think that was probably about it. And the task was, I mean, obviously digital broadcasting was going to happen. I mean, it was a government policy, it was going to happen whether we liked it or not. So it was a matter of trying to find a way that would make it valuable, enriching for audiences, and meaningful for people who are working in the organisation. It would provide other opportunities of different ways of making radio and television programs and other forms of what we call content. As I say, there was quite a lot of resistance to it internally, and I remember at one point convening a meeting. So I was relatively new to this role, and with the ABC at that stage was sort of in Sydney, was still across a couple of sites, and there was quite a bit of and people didn't. The silos were strong, so people in television didn't talk to radio, radio didn't talk to news. No, it was a very segmented organisation. And I remember taking the whole big boardroom and saying, and I think there were probably about 30 people in the room, and saying to them, okay, look, I'm new here, so I don't know you all. You know, can we go around and introduce each other? Pretty standard sort of meeting exercise. I was astonished that many of them didn't know each other. I mean, they'd been working for the organisation for donkeys in many cases, and they hadn't actually met each other before. Such was the sort of segmentation of what was the old ABC. And I realised that as this went on, that there were a group of people who were going to be opposed to everything, whatever it was, because it was change and they didn't like it. And they'd seen bad things happen when governments tried to mandate change in the past. And there were people who were much more open to the possibilities. And so we did a sort of pretty standard SWOT analysis, and I thought, I'm going to put all the threats people in one group, because if I don't put them all in one group, they're going to sort of infiltrate everywhere else. If they're in one group and they can concentrate on their threats, they'll be able to come up with the best list of threats. And they were right about many of the threats. They're absolutely right. But we needed to find a way of moving forward. At the time, so this is digital television that we were talking about. At the time, the big media companies, there was still Kerry Packer was still lording it over the land. Rupert Murdoch was very closely involved with Foxtel, and saw this as an opportunity to get Foxtel and Ten back into his fold. Fairfax was not long broken up, and there was a real tension. There was a real expectation, shall I say, by the owners of the commercial media that the last thing they wanted was digital broadcasting, which meant that there was more than one channel. They knew how to make money out of having one channel and one channel only, because that's where they could plonk their advertisers, and that's where the advertisers would pay top dollar, and that was what they wanted. Which was sort of against the ethos of digital broadcasting, which made it possible to have multiple channels. And I remember during that period, Kerry Packer would go down to Canberra and swan around, and he'd do these big demonstrations and displays for members of Parliament, where he'd have huge big screens and look at this fantastic high definition television. We have one channel, that's what everyone can watch, high definition television. Anyway, as it turned out, eventually but the counter-argument was the logical one, that if this spectrum was going to be freed up, it was going to be sold, then there was digital broadcasting capacity, which was going to mean that there was capacity for more channels in the same amount of space. Richard Alston was the minister at the time. He was a very antagonistic minister to the ABC. And I remember going to a meeting with him because we'd come up with some models of how the ABC might do digital broadcasting differently, how it might be embedded in the community, embedded in the states, cascade up to national services, having multiple channels. And I remember showing it to the minister, and he was actually, despite himself, quite impressed. And he got me then to do these tours around the country to other MPs and so on, but he still couldn't buy that it was really coming from the ABC. And so at one point in one of these meetings, he said, well, this is very good, but why should we do it? And I said, well, if you do it like this, you'll be able to sell all that other spectrum really quite profitably, put it back for other use. At which point the minister said, well, why would we want to do that? At which point his advisors all gathered around him and said, Minister, that's the point of what we're doing. We're trying to free up this spectrum so we can do something else. Anyway, eventually, of course, the legislation evolved, and the ABC and SBS were initially able to do multi-channelling. The free-to-airs weren't. Now that's sort of moved on, and we've got, you know, all those endless channels with junk television all the time. Sorry, it may have been a good thing. One of the conditions that was put on it was that if the ABC and SBS were to do multi-channelling, as it was called at the time, there would be money for the technical stuff, that is, for the spectrum and for the broadcast, you know, the distribution, but there would be no money for content. And this is sort of the standard thing. We've seen it all the time. In Sydney Modern, the new museum in Sydney is about to open. A lot of rich people have put their hands in their pocket to give money to build the building. There's been a bit of money going into providing money for artists, you know, for the work that's going to go into the building, much, much smaller. It's always, you know, it's the pattern all the same, you know, that you build the building and you worry about the content later. So that was a sort of, you know, something that was a sort of early warning sign in a way for what, you know, what was going to come. I think some of the things that were foreseen and some weren't, in terms of what the digital transformation would mean. The first that was foreseen was that there would be a shared platform, you know, that all content could be reduced to a digital stream. So whether it was print or newspapers or articles or TV or images or sound, it could all be reduced to a digital stream. And that was a huge change, you know, from a siloed system where something was either television or radio or print, and really you couldn't make the move between them, to something of being about the content and its ease of movement from one platform to another. That was really a huge difference. Some of the other things that were foreseen, I mean, we foresaw, I think, to a fairly reasonable degree that this would be global, that it would be possible in this environment. If there were no barriers between print, radio and television, there's not going to be many barriers between something that's produced in the United States or Britain or anywhere else than here as well. So that ease of movement of content globally was very much foreseen. We foresaw that it would be a way of being able to access all sorts of information that you would never once have been able to get to, and that's certainly happened. And for people who are even moderately skilled researchers, I mean, the capacity to find stuff out now that you couldn't have found out, you know, even 10 years ago is remarkable. I mean, I couldn't have written a book if it hadn't been for that, because I could go in easily and check stuff. I could go back to original sources that were digitised somewhere and check them. So that was the thing we foresaw. We foresaw, I think, but with slightly rosy glasses, that it would be an opportunity for building community. And you see that now. I mean, you saw it in the early days of Facebook. People built their own communities. You see it to a degree in the sort of Facebook communities where people build their communities. There's a capacity to actually engage with people who you share ideas and thoughts and aspirations with in a digital space in a way that wasn't once possible. What we didn't foresee, I think, was the toxicity and the way, the flip side of that, ability to create a community, created an opportunity for people to behave in the way they probably always had done. I mean, people have always been awful to each other behind their backs. It's just now that the veil's gone a bit and we can actually see what's being said, that it's much more confronting and quite dangerous and has had terrible consequences. And I'm really, really pleased that I don't have teenage children at the moment, because I'm sure it's a really difficult sort of world to be navigating. So we didn't see that. One of the things that I got involved in during that period, because it was not long after the Commonwealth government, the federal government under John Howard and Richard Ellison had made that first very, very big cut to the ABC. It was about $60 million a year that was taken out. At the time, there were still 5,500 to 6,000 employees at the ABC. It was still a big organisation, and that cut was devastating. It really went to the core of the organisation. It made it almost impossible to maintain the diversity of information and activities in the states. I mean, you saw the end of the state 7:30 reports, which I know still rankles with people. You saw the end of the in-house production machines, you know, some of the areas which were very, very strong natural history. I'm always reminded of when I'm in Tasmania, because it was such a strong area of ABC production. It wasn't possible to maintain it under these funding sources. And as I say, I was reporting directly to Brian Johns, who was an unusual man, but he had quite a lateral brain. And he said, well, why don't we try and find another source of funding which is equivalent to the money that we are paying out elsewhere. So at the time, the ABC paid $20 million a year to the BBC to basically cherry pick any BBC programs we wanted to have. Yeah, there were some restraints, but basically that was it. $20 million gave you everything. It was a licence fee. He said, well, if this digital world is going to happen, and there are going to be many, many platforms, why can't we find somebody who will pay us a licence fee to reuse some of our content? And at the time, Telstra was still the dominant telecommunications carrier and had big ambitions about what they might do. And so we went through a protracted process and got an agreement with Telstra that they would pay a licence fee of $55 million a year for 4 years. We'd have no editorial content, you know, no editorial oversight, but would license ABC content for use on what he'd imagined were going to be its big platforms. Didn't quite work out for Telstra, but that was the sort of the ambition. Now, at the time, the big players internationally, as they still are now, basically worked on the basis that they didn't pay for content. Content was just something that filled their pipes. News Corp was very involved with Foxtel in the UK at the time, or what do they call it, Foxstar? Yeah, in the US. And in the UK, and they ran a service. They were running a cable service, essentially like all the American cable services, where they didn't pay anyone for the content. You had to find another way of making money. So the content was put onto their pipes. They made the money out of the subscription fee, but the content providers didn't. So there was real resistance even then to paying for content to go onto any of these platforms. Anyway, this deal was negotiated and passed a Senate inquiry, and you know, there's lots of opposition because people thought that maybe we're selling ABC, no. And eventually it got to the point where, you know, it did settle down. Sadly, the last negotiation was something that Jonathan Shire, who by then had become managing director, got to negotiate. And he thought, I think in the last stage, that maybe he could get more money for it. $55 million was a lot of money in 2000. I mean, it's still a lot of money, but it was a special lot of money then. I think Jonathan picked up some of the opposition to the idea and thought that there was probably more money to be had. In the process, blew up the negotiation and then started saying that this would have been a terrible idea. Nonetheless, it fell over, that money didn't come back in, and the cuts continued into the ABC that we've all seen. Strikingly, this last year, the ACCC decided that the reuse of content by Google and Facebook particularly was something which was not being adequately compensated for. The ACCC's general view about looking at monopoly in the media has been not to look at what happens in terms of information, but to look at what happens to the advertising market. And they saw an advertising market that was not shrinking, but the money in it was going to Google and Facebook. It wasn't going back to the old media companies. And so in the concern about that commercial threat to the media companies, which have had so much sway in this country for so long, they set about coming up with what's called a news media bargaining code. And the news media bargaining code has been of enormous benefit to the commercial media companies. Robert Thompson, the CEO of News Corp, says that it's worth a 9-figure sum to news. The 9 papers look like they've got about 97 million. The Guardian's about 27 million, 7 around the same number as 9. The ABC annual report suggests it's about 11 or 12 million the ABC has got as a result of this licensing agreement for Google and Facebook for making ABC content available online. So it's a sort of trade-off for the advertising that was lost. It's very interesting that I was talking to Sam before, that as a result of that ABC money, there's been a growth, especially in regional staff, so that there's a number of people here in Tasmania who are essentially funded by the money that's come from that that project. That's essentially what we were talking about 25 years ago in terms of this sort of licensing agreement, that there will be content would be treated differently, become a commodity, and there was money to be made because there will be other people who make money out of it. Now, I don't want to re-prosecute that thing as something that's in the past, but it is interesting when I talk about there were things we anticipated and things we didn't. And so some of those things are now taking shape in a way that we didn't quite predict. Now, the other thing, of course, which was going on at this time, and this comes to that sort of question about the toxicity and what's happening as a result of social media and the sort of thinning out of the democratic conversation, is that we've actually, since about that same time, been involved in a particularly nasty exercise of what's been called cultural wars. And I don't like that term, I've always sort of resisted it, but I think it is actually probably the right term to use, because what we've seen over this last 25 years has been an attempt to undermine a confident sense of the good values of what it means to be a member of this nation, to be part of society. And there's been a very concerted effort to undermine confidence in that conversation. And it's happened in the time-honoured Australian fashion of picking off tall poppies. So the first targets were the historians who were writing things which were not of comfort to the government of the day. And I guess the earliest warning of that was when Alexander Downer, as Foreign Minister, was due to go to Washington. This was within a couple of months of the election of the Howard government in '96. He was due to go to Washington, I think it was about May, June of that year. And the gift that he was due to give to the president of George Washington University was a bound set of the Manning Clark History of Australia. And Downer just said, no, I refuse to give that to you. Find something else. That's not something that I'm prepared to have as a gift of a representative of this country. A few months later, we had the Courier Mail deciding that Manning Clark had been a Soviet agent. And a couple of months after that, John Howard decided that rather than keeping Pauline Hanson on the outside with her sort of racist views and inflammatory sort of language, that he would embrace her. And it caused great tension in the Liberal Party. I mean, it led to the collapse of the Liberal Party vote in Queensland. But from that moment, really, until this last election, the 3% of people who favoured that sort of racist, xenophobic, inward-looking view of Australia have had an extraordinary whip hand in Australian politics. I think that's sort of come to an end in this last election, not because of, I think it just sort of ran out of puff in a way. You know, the emptiness of their threats and fears were seen. I mean, after the historians, I mean, we saw then the other targets were, of course, the High Court, because the High Court had audaciously ruled for Mabo and Wick. So the judges were accused of judicial extremism and all sorts of other heinous crimes. And in more recent times, we've seen it play out with attacks on Adam Goodes. We've seen it play out in attacks on Yasmin Abdel-Majid. We've seen it play out on the head of the Human Rights Commission. We saw it play out on the head of the Solicitor General. But primarily women and people of colour have been the sort of target groups. And so that really makes people nervous. I mean, it made people inside the ABC nervous, because if you're giving a platform to people who are going to be viciously attacked by those who've got the loudest microphone, you feel vulnerable in that situation. So I think that the combination of a developing incivility with the social media and the internet and making it more febrile meant that the weakening of the ties of the democracy was a work in progress. You know, something which has been quite effective. And I write a bit about this in the book, partly from some of my own experiences. Now, that I think has been a real issue, and the ABC has been one of the real targets in that. I mean, it started off during those years, those Howard Alston years, you know, with I mean, it had gone on before that, but it really reached new highs during that period, with the numbers of complaints that were absorbing senior staff in finding answers to was extraordinary, and just kept on growing. And there was never a satisfactory answer as far as they were concerned. It was just something that needed to be attacked. Now, there were probably areas where the ABC was not as outward-looking as it needed to be, but nonetheless, it was an environment which was quite manufactured to make people feel under threat, and nervous and defensive.
which had an effect back on the whole community, because as we've seen with the releasing of the coin from the Mint, you know, the ABC remains a very much loved institution. It was the hardest thing in a way for the sort of cultural wars to take on. It was the most revered organisation. When we did, you know, trust surveys, ABC was up there. Most favoured brand, ABC, up the top. It was a hard institution to take on because it had earned such a strong place in the hearts and minds of Australians. But nonetheless, that's what happened, and it's gone on for years. You know, waxing and waning, a bit of extra money here. I mean, I had a period of one session on for 5 years when I was on the ABC board, which was a period when there was more money available. But you know, the questioning of ABC's commitment to the nation is one that just keeps on recurring. The weird thing, or maybe it's not weird, maybe it's what was intended, is that the productivity of the ABC over this period has increased extraordinarily. You know, I mentioned before the number of outlets that were available when I was working in that corporate role. Now, what have we got? We've got ABC Main Channel, we've got ABC High Definition, we've got ABC Plus, we've got ABC Me, we've got ABC Kids, we've got the news channel, that's in television. Then we've got all those extra podcast services, all those extra digital radio stations, we've got all the online stuff. We've got the apps, we've got the output has been extraordinary. This has been at a time when the actual dollars, according to Michael Ward's research, is actually less in real terms than it was in the early 1980s. And the staff, I think, is around, correct me, 3,500, something like that. So when the country is talking about productivity all the time, you want the best example of a productivity improvement, it's probably the ABC. I mean, it really is doing so much more for with so much less. Now, as was mentioned before, I mean, this is the 90th anniversary, and it's the 100th anniversary of the BBC. And I would recommend to you, there's a lovely article in The Guardian overnight by Ian Jack about the 100th anniversary of the BBC. Now, sometimes I think, when I think about the way the ABC's put up with all these attacks that have gone on so strongly for so long, and we've heard so much in recent times as well about the way coercive control works, that it's been a bit like a coercive control situation. The people have been sort of battered, they've absorbed it, they've tried to find another way through, they've kept going, oh, next time it'll be all right, no, it won't happen, it'll be all right, we'll get there. And yet, amazingly, the organisation continues to garner such strong support, and that boost in membership of Friends of the ABC is an extraordinary figure, because in most other sectors of the sort of volunteer community, that's not what's happening. Numbers are falling, not rising. So, as I said before, I think that the election marked the end of this phase of this last 25-year phase of the culture wars. Because 65% of the population voted one way or another for a candidate who was not locked into that old way of thinking. The actual number of votes of the sort of far-right candidates fell, and we've seen a degree of engagement in the political process, which is sort of without precedent. The numbers of people who are involved in those independent campaigns, in the Teal campaigns, the community action works and so on, is something that's not been seen. It's not that people are stepping away from politics, they're actually stepping into it and seeing what they can do more actively themselves, rather than through some of the institutions which have sort of held the whip hand in the past. Which brings me to my sort of final sort of thoughts, that is, why was the ABC and the BBC established? And if we were to ask that question now, what answers would we come up with? In many ways, it was that they were responses to the technical problems of how broadcasting could happen, because radio was the wireless, and it was in a box, and you came pre-tuned to stations. I mean, very nicely that the ABC kept the LO call signals, which was what the BBC did, that is LO for London, was the ABC call signal in many places for a long time. But it was designed to solve a technical problem which emerged because of radio, the way the wireless system was evolving. And it took some time before there was a realisation that actually it could also be helpful in a sort of sense of nation building, in a sense of a public communication, in an exchange and a development. And that really gathered force, I think it's important to note, after the Second World War, when it was clear that the media companies internationally risked formal regulation unless they found a way to behave in a more socially responsible fashion. And that sort of rise of social responsibility in the media was really under threat of regulation. And in countries like Australia and Britain and Canada, that social responsibility, sort of the organisation that carried that at its heart was the public broadcaster, and that infected the others. The other media organisations took that on. Now that notion of social responsibility in the US, it sort of was captured in the fairness doctrine, got broken down when platforms became something that just everything got put out on. And so it's worth sort of thinking about in this environment where again we're under enormous technological change, what is the problem that something like the ABC solves? Now I've got a few sort of tentative answers to that. One is that at a time when the media as an organised force is being weakened, it's the only place where there is a possibility of a national conversation. Within each of the states, which have also seen their media systems dramatically eroded, it's the only place where you can have an active state conversation, where you can be really involved in monitoring not just the politics and the business and commercial end, but also the sort of cultural things, the social activities, the glues that hold society together. The ABC is better placed to do that than anyone else. I mean, I don't know what the numbers of people who are employed in media in Tasmania anymore, but I would imagine it's very small. And certainly at a time when the population is growing and there are bigger issues than you've ever had to deal with, in recent times, you need more than one outlet to be able to do that. So I think that scope for the national and local conversation is really important. It's particularly important because the ease of being swamped globally is much greater than it's ever been. It's a press of the button and you're watching Saturday Night Live, direct from the US. Well, why not? Okay, I'm interested in what's happening in America, but I'd like to know a bit more about what's going on here. So I think that national identity and that local conversation is really the bedrock of the answer. The other is that. But to do that, you've actually got to take really serious steps. You've actually got to make sure that the regulatory environment is engaged and that people feel that they can have input into it. I'm interested that there's not been in Australia a proper inquiry into the future of public broadcasting in this environment. It's always seemed to me that it was something that needed to be done. And I think probably how it needs to be done is as a sort of deliberative democracy sort of exercise. I mean, I'd really like to see not just, performance events where senior executives and others come and talk to people, but really that process of engaging very actively with local communities across the nation to answer that question, what is it that the ABC can provide that nobody else. Actually, I'll put SBS in as well. I mean, I'm strongly of the view that they should remain separate, but I do think that they are playing, and in ITV as well, they're playing a really important part in these conversations. So, what is the purpose of public broadcasting in this very much more fragmented, globally easily accessed environment? It's going to cost money. It must cost money. And to pretend that it won't is just foolish. Australia's not been good at paying for culture. We thought we could pick it up from elsewhere. We've actually got to pay for it. We've got to give culture the same standing as other pillars of the society. And that means finding money to make it possible. I was horrified to see that the total number of hours last year produced of children's drama in Australia was 41 hours. That's across, we've got all the streamers, we've got all the commercial TV stations who didn't pay a licence fee or paid hardly any licence fee during the COVID period. 41 hours of children's television. I mean, that's, it's not even an hour a week. So if you've got kids and grandchildren, I mean, how are they going to be seeing contemporaneous Australian stories, in the moving image, if that's the sort of level of funding that's been made available? So it will cost, but as I say, I think it needs to go back to that grassroots to find out what it is that people are looking for. How would you think about differently doing things if you took this as a serious task as the ABC and SBS and ITV as a group as really one of the bastions of making this democracy thicker, not thinner. Thank you.
Don't sit down. Well, it's a bit like a fine wine, isn't it? Just creeps up you with, thoughts creep in and lots of questions.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Julia. That was a fabulous address and so much great information. I've just joined University of Tasmania as the head of the media school. Yes, hello everybody, and thank you for the invitation. Fantastic to meet everybody. So my name's Alana Mann, and I've been at University of Sydney for the last over a decade, and I have a question for you about the role of universities. I want to know how we're doing. I want to know what we need to do to attract graduates and to give them the education they need to deal with this incredibly complex environment you've described. Thank you.
Yes, well, of course, the universities have been one of the other areas that were very much under attack in this whole period that we've seen. And as I sort of do write in the book, I mean, it has been something that was very deliberate. It wasn't something that just happened. I think what the universities did, a bit like the ABC, as I say, the ABC's become more productive with less resources. The universities have done the same. They've figured out, because they're smart people, how to actually keep their business going and keep students being educated and so on, despite, really sprawling levels of public funding, which is, in my view, where the bulk of it should be coming from. I recently retired from Griffith, so I'm an emeritus there rather than a staff member. And part of the reason I left was that I just thought I couldn't see how you broke the logjam, in a way, of the logic of the sort of economic model that the universities are working on now, to get back to something which was purpose-driven rather than an ever-growing enterprise. Now, that's not to say that there isn't great work being done in the universities, great staff, the management is working as best they can, but it's sort of with one hand tied behind your back. In terms of students, though, I would have thought, I know that this COVID period has been terribly disruptive for students, and it's really very difficult for them to have established that sort of community that has traditionally been a big part of the university experience. But I don't see any serious signs that students are not wanting that experience, that they're not wanting that education, they're not wanting their horizons to be broadened. And in a way, I mean, one of the markers of that has been that despite the changes to fees and so on for arts degrees, which were introduced by the previous government, the numbers of students enrolled in those degrees has actually kept up, got higher in many cases. So I think it's about universities restating the purpose of their existence. And that's about that individual education, but it's also about that civic responsibility within their communities and beyond.
Thanks, Joanne. I'm pleased you raised the question of the need for a thorough analysis of the role of public broadcasting, because I think it is very much needed. But a few years ago, I had a phone call from The Australian, and it was their idea that they wanted to have a review of public broadcasting. And of course, I was asked what was ABC Friends' view, and I'm afraid I said, no way, not at the moment. I put it a little more discreetly, of course. But how do we, I would feel more confident at the moment having an inquiry into how we should be planning for public broadcasting in the future. But how do we do that and protect the whole notion of public broadcasting? Because there are still too many people out there who would say, sell it off.
Yeah. That was a very good response to the Australian. I mean, I think that there were a couple of very interesting inquiries that were done by the BBC in the UK a few years ago. Robert Putnam did one, and there was a sort of an independent one, and there was an official one. So there was one that was done by BCMS, the Department of Media Culture, and blah blah blah, and one that was done in a sort of quasi-independent fashion.
And I think I'm actually more interested in that independent inquiry, in a sense, than in the official one. I mean, there is a place for an official one, but it takes an enormous amount of resources to do it. And unless you've got a clearer sense of where you're wanting it to end up, it's a captive fortune. So what I'm a bit interested in, I don't know whether anyone's really got the capacity to do it, but I guess Friends of the ABC is probably a good sort of starting point to think about it, is that we can use the model of the Uluru process, of a sort of deliberative process of deep community engagement. That if you looked at a deliberative process around the role of public broadcasting, and you actually built up a sort of sense of what it was that people were looking for, is it about content production? Is it about conversation? Is it about community? Is it about politics? Is it about, there's a whole lot of possibilities. I think you change the ground rules. So rather than there being terms of reference that get written to sort of suit the interest groups that may want to see it picked off, and the IPA still has the Liberal Party, I think, still has an official policy of sale of the ABC. I mean, the MPs stepped away from it, but I think that was still a policy that was adopted at the convention a couple of years ago. So I think that it's important that if that were to happen, that it's done from the bottom up, in a sense, with a groundswell which is actually open to other possibilities. I mean, in much the same way as the Uluru Dialogues didn't come up with an outcome which was necessarily what people had thought it was going to do. I think there's an argument for doing something similar, for the ABC or for public broadcasting. And I'd be looking to like-minded organisations, I was involved in some conversations a few years ago with the learned academies who were interested in it because they could see the problem of the diminution of expertise and the valuing of expertise, and that was a problem for them. So I don't know whether anyone's got the energy to do it, but it would seem to me that that would be the more productive way to sort of shape the conversation before there is such an inquiry. The work that Robert Putnam and others did in the UK in that independent review that they held a few years ago, I think provides some quite useful sort of pointers.
I'm just wondering if there is a means for an expansion of community awareness over the word trust that's been used quite a lot in the last year prior to the federal election this year, but there are obviously organizations that have conducted the surveys that have interviewed people on the street, so vox pop, and got their input as to what, from their perspective, trust means. So is there any movement towards expanding on releasing those comments to the public rather than this sort of top-down, we need an inquiry, which seems almost, I think, to me, sometimes the word inquiry suggests that there's something wrong, as in, we're going to inquire because bad deed doing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not talking about, three judges sitting up at a table doing the sort of inquiry. I'm talking about something which is much more organic than that, which I hope I make clear. The trust stuff is so important, and that's, the corrosion of that trust, the erosion of that trust is obviously a big part of what drove the election result. That the whole demand for an integrity commission is because trust in the institutions as they've been existing has waned, and so there was a sense that people felt that something needed to be done. It was interesting during the pandemic. I mean, Australia's. I'm going to draw on Howard's story. John Howard, when he was elected, said he was going to restore trust, and it fell down, and it kept falling down. And when he went to the election after Tampa, he was saying it even more. It's going to be, I'm making sure that people. I've got the words there in the book. The trust was his big claim. At the time, level of trust was actually falling. I mean, it's that capacity to misuse language for a political end is extraordinary. And I think there's been some of that around the whole trust discussion. I mean, obviously, trust is an issue that has broken down as many of the institutions that we have in the past trusted have either revealed themselves to be flawed, the churches,
A good example, schools, like there's a whole lot of the institutions that we previously had trust in have been shown to be wanting. And so people, not unreasonably, have felt, well, why can I trust them? I mean, clearly they've not done what they're meant to have done, when I put that trust in them. So I think there are a couple of things. One, I think is there's a whole institutional rebuilding that needs to happen. During the pandemic, early on, we saw a rise in trust because government was stepping in and doing things that needed to be done. It fell away, and it fell away most sharply amongst the most disadvantaged, because as we've seen, that the most disadvantaged are the people who got the least support, in a sense, from the government support during the pandemic. They were the ones most likely to have been locked down and so on. So it sort of secured us. That is, I think that the institutions in which we've trusted have shown themselves to be not as trustworthy as they might be, so there's a need for that institutional rebuilding. There is a need to actually, that's the main thing. It's an institutional rebuilding of which the Integrity Commission, I think, will be a useful exercise.
I'm interested in your ideas on the ABC and soft diplomacy. We seem to have come to a grinding halt with the reduction of, is it red in Australia? Red, yes.
Yeah.
And we seem to have lost so much, and yet you could offer so much.
Yeah.
Just your ideas on that.
Yeah, I mean, that loss of Radio Australia, the loss of the shortwave broadcasting, and the loss of the ABC TV network. I mean, when the Abbott government came in and just threw out the contract that the previous government had signed with the ABC for international broadcasting, I was on the board. I was just horrified. I mean, I thought, actually, if I'm in a commercial organisation and somebody's just trashed a contract, I'm going to take them to court. This is just not the way that normal commercial business is done. But such it's the sort of cohesive control thing. Such was the fear that something might be done badly if that happened, that they didn't go ahead. I think that what you're seeing now is the interest in the Pacific coming to the fore again. That there's obviously a revival of the idea of doing more broadcasting or broadcasting and related services with media into the Pacific. As Ian Jack writes in this article in The Guardian about the BBC, it's the BBC is the single best cultural export that Britain could ever have come up with. And I think Australia's always been a bit in the shadow of that, but ABC international broadcasting in various forms has been really important, and I would like to see there being money made available for it to be restored.
Thanks very much, Professor. I'm the ABC's alumni representative in the great country of Tasmania. Thank you for that stuff you said too. A lot of us I joined the ABC at 67, and I'm a great believer in it, and SBS of course, and you can't do more than risk your life for an organisation, all the wars I've covered for them. One of the things I've noticed, which I think is so important, plus all the stuff you're talking about, is staff morale. Now, it's absolutely shocking. The salary structure, the lack of communication, we're in the communication business, and without an enthusiastic staff, there's not much hope. And you've got some wonderful people who are dedicated to public broadcast. They don't do it for money, they do it because they care. Yeah. The other thing, quickly, Peter, sorry, is in the last 10 or so years of wandering around Australia, and when I talk about the ABC consistently to people, is our age group, or a lot of young ones don't even watch it anymore. They go straight to whatever, online and all the other stuff. I'm talking about terrestrial television and radio. I think is very good, just quickly. But I think we've got to get management to come out and say things like you've just said. David Anderson and his team should be spending a lot of time going around and explaining this, because everybody's saying to me, I don't watch the ABC anymore. They're all in their 18s or 20s. They've reporters. How can I have faith in them? We're all 18 and 20 at some stage. And this worries me, because and is there a future for television with those, particularly with the online and all the platforms now? Thank you for taking that question.
I'm not close enough to comment on staff morale, but I'm sure that your observation is right. From my sort of more distant, observing. I think you're absolutely right that there are still very, very good people and people who are very committed to what they're doing and the reason they're doing it. But they need more support, and it's why I use that sort of cohesive control image, because it's like if you're constantly fearful that you're going to get hammered for something, you tend to retreat. You become a bit more defensive, and so that's a problem. I mean, I agree. It would seem that the incoming government is committed to increasing funding and providing a longer term for funding, which I think are good things. But it's a matter of getting onto the front foot and having a bit of initiative and imagination. I mean, there are some very good things on ABC television. There's some very good things on ABC radio. There's good stuff happening. I guess my concern, in a way, is that apart from the news and current affairs space, ABC is not at the forefront of the big national conversations, the cultural conversations and the political conversations we need to have. And I think, and a little example, is that the Australian Wars, which was a terrific series which SBS has just done, they did a fabulous job. It was really important stuff. And it had an effect, that is, that the National War Memorial the board decided that they should look at the Wars of Foundation, maybe. That should have been something that the ABC had done. I mean, that should be something. I'm happy that SBS has done it, so don't get me wrong, but it just seems to me that intruding into those big national conversations around these things takes a certain amount of courage, and it means you've got to be prepared to embrace difficult ideas, knowing that you're going to get clobbered along the way, but having the courage of the conviction, because I was talking about change before, 3 years and 10. It takes a long time, but you've got to be feeding it. And you're feeding those discussions, change will happen. Look at the gay marriage thing. I mean, 20 years ago, the prospect of gay marriage being absolutely normalised, we had this huge, vicious debates here in Tasmania over homosexuality. Would have been unimaginable. It happens in a flash. Who's heard anything apart from a bit of whinging by some of the sort of churches about it ever since? All those bakers who are going to have to try and sell her and her cakes, somehow they've survived. So the capacity for people to accommodate change in their most intimate relations, we've seen time and again, can be done. There's just a timidity and caution about doing that at a national conversation. And that's partly because people who put their heads up have got clobbered. So it's a time for a bit more courage.
Look,